And let's talk about the situation in Europe today. Now, things are looking really desperate, and it looks like the EU is really going to be abandoned. It's critical we don't lose sight of what's happening in that theatre of war, because the more freaked out the Europeans get, the more missteps they will do. We have Starmer already pledging $3 billion annually for the next 100 years. Von der Leyen is also beating the money drums, demanding nearly $1 trillion to rearm Europe. But the worst is yet to come. Elon Musk, who seems to be the man behind the curtain, is now declaring for the United States to leave NATO. From the American perspective, now this sounds pragmatic. You leave NATO and you will be able to save a ton of money. You simply can't afford it when you are already cutting US government jobs. But for Brussels, this is unthinkable. Your entire existence today is to counter Russia, which obviously you can't alone considering the state of your military. And if the US exits the security umbrella, where are you going to find the money? Now, for all his faults, Trump is actually on the money with this one. NATO is being heavily subsidized by the United States. They are all living under a big patron who is paying over $860 billion of a $1.3 trillion defense bill. That's more than two-thirds of the burden. And it's $860 billion every single year. How can the EU afford this? Bond yields are already rising. Tariffs from Trump are also coming. How are they going to conjure this money without imploding their own economies? And chances are Brussels will just issue a ton of war bonds, a ton of EU bonds to rack up one of the biggest rearmaments in modern history. It's quite crazy because markets actually believe Europe's plan will work, and that's why the euro is rising over the past few days, over the past few weeks. They believe that the war economy will drive the EU into perpetual growth. But here's the problem. The biggest beneficiaries will be defense contractors and the people at the very top who have a ton of money to buy up all the assets. EU stocks are already outperforming the S&P by over 10%. No one saw this coming. And it really proves the fact that assets today are truly decoupled from the real economy. If we really compare them to the state of Europe, EU stocks should be in the gutter. In the next 5 years, German debt is slated to increase by over 600 billion euros as well instead of going down. So German yields are expected to rise above US bonds. Here's the problem. Europe can't do this forever. Sooner or later, the money will stop, and if they aren't spending it on productive industries, it won't be net beneficial. They will have a bunch of tanks and missiles, but no real civilian industries. And how is that going to benefit the majority of people? It really doesn't. So we can really expect inequality in Europe to widen, and this is where we must talk a bit about Kursk. The collapse of that front is sending shockwaves across the EU. Russia is on the brink of retaking the whole region, or perhaps they already have. Either way, this spells doom for the EU leadership that's looking to back Ukraine until the bitter end. We all remember the weird bargain Zelensky gave Putin to exchange Kursk for Russian-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine. Now, we all knew Putin was never ever going to bite, but now that card is evaporating fast. It won't even be a bargaining chip on the table. Even Western media is warning of the threat of encirclement. Russia's counteroffensive has managed to carve a wedge to isolate the Sudzha region, and that would leave thousands of troops at risk of encirclement. It's important to understand how Russia views war. It's part of their diplomatic strategy. Outcomes on a battlefield drive foreign policy and even economic policy decisions much more than the reverse. And this puts Putin in a much stronger position to arm twist more concessions from Ukraine, the EU, and even the United States themselves. Remember the ceasefire Putin was floating? Well, his bargaining chips on the table have increased by a lot. And if you're the Europeans, you'll be freaking out, and rightfully so. Your industrial base is shattered, cheap Russian gas also isn't flowing. So the only solution left is to pump in even more money to try to remedy the situation. Now, will Trump come in and save the EU? We can safely say that he won't. Time and time again across many interviews, he's regretting the aid Ukraine received from the US in the Biden administration.
Biden should have never put up $350 billion. He should have equalized with Europe. All he had to do is say, you got to stay even with us. They're in for 100. We're in for 350. How does that? And we have an ocean in between us, right? We're not in the danger that they are. They are in much greater danger, if you call it danger. He should have never done that. You know, the other thing with Europe that bothers me? They've given Russia more money by far for buying their oil than they put into Ukraine. So they're paying all this money to Russia, and we're in there for $350 billion.
It's really interesting when we look at how the EU is responding to the collapse of Kursk and the US leaving Europe. Meloni, for example, is proposing giving Ukraine the security of NATO without the actual membership of the alliance. And this is problematic on so many levels. Firstly, won't that require the US to agree as well? And we all know Trump won't agree to that. In fact, this will push the United States even further away from funding NATO. But let's touch a bit about Putin's ceasefire terms, because the West is probably going to choke on them. Understand the environment we are in. Russia holds a very strong edge, both on the battlefield and in diplomacy with the US. So Putin can demand a lot, and we can see what he's asking from the West today. Russia is demanding a withdrawal from the annexed regions, including the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. It's really clear that Russia wants to flush Ukrainian presence out of there to eventually claim the regions. Trump and the defense secretary has hinted on many occasions that the captured territories would probably be ceded to Russia. So this is most likely just some kind of administrative step. The second condition is more straightforward and is non-negotiable for peace. Ukraine must not join NATO and formally abandon their membership bid. This message is obviously directed at the Americans to arm twist Ukraine and the EU to accept, because at the state of their militaries today and their economies, the state of how it is in, they simply have no bargaining power with Russia. In his latest interview, Trump has more or less confirmed he is fine with a Ukrainian defeat.
Are you comfortable with that? The fact that you walked away and Ukraine may not survive?
Well, it may not survive anyway, but, you know, we have some weaknesses with Russia. You know, it takes two. Look, it was not going to happen, that war, and it happened. So now we're stuck with this mess. Think of what he stuck me with.
Because in all honesty, it doesn't affect the US directly. They are an ocean apart, and the US is hungry for resources everywhere, including from Russia. It's a reason why the Kremlin actually proposed deals to develop rare earth deposits. And if the US wants to revive their industries and take on China, which is the bigger grand strategy, the strategy of containment, they have to secure the critical minerals. Russia is full of them, and they hold a lot of leverage over US decision making. That's just a reality. Now, what the Europeans want are security guarantees that require a US backstop, basically backed by the US military, but Trump is not going to commit. The US has already put military support, and the longer the war drags out, Russia's negotiating position is only going to get stronger and stronger. We could reach a point where Europe has to concede a lot more down the road. In hindsight, maybe Ukraine might have been better taking the US mineral deal that would at least commit US companies and manpower to develop the resources. And yes, I get it, it's the devil's deal. But at this point, there are really no good options left for the West, because the US is literally pulling away all support to Ukraine. No intelligence, no military aid, and probably no money very soon. But I want to take a moment to talk about the frozen Russian assets, because that will be a very big point of contention. Now, understand how damaged Western institutions have been over the seizure. And we have talked about this at length, and why the carnage we are witnessing today in the bond markets, they're all a result of this. And now France wants to tap the frozen assets for additional $200 million this year. These will be using the interest generated from the reserves, but frankly, it's just digging the EU into a deeper hole. Now, what if Putin pushes them to return the $200 billion in assets? Will the Europeans release the funds from Euroclear and give it back to the Russians? Because if they do, we could see bond yields in Europe fly to the moon. Russia would most definitely liquidate those bonds and power them into other assets. Russia's sovereign wealth fund is completely de-dollarized. They have also removed any holdings of euros. 60% of it are RMB assets, and up to 40% is physical gold. So will Europe willingly give back the money? Well guys, my hunch is that they won't. Considering the state of their economies and the trillions of euros needed to rebuild their militaries, we can kind of expect the assets to be completely used up. Now, 200 billion or 300 billion is a lot of money, but Russia would forego the money to grab even more territory. And let's not forget, Ukraine might have a lot of resources below the ground. It might be true. It is also the breadbasket of the world. And this would reinforce Russia's position as a commodity giant. And frankly, if we look at the US position, Trump really doesn't care how things play out as long as the US benefits and gets something.
We're trying to integrate our economies. We're trying to make sure that Ukraine has value to the American economy, a win-win situation. They're the richest country in Europe in terms of critical minerals, which is the oil of the 21st century. So doing a deal with Ukraine is beneficial to both countries. It's not extortion. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do a deal with Ukraine where we can make $500 billion in the critical mineral space for our own economy, give them money, help them develop their resources so they can grow their economy and defend themselves? That's not extortion. That's a good business deal.
But look at it from another perspective. If Ukraine really turns out to have very little minerals and Russia makes the right offer, we can be sure Trump will ramp up pressure to end the conflict. There are a lot of critical mineral deposits across Ukraine, and don't forget Russia is gradually gaining more territory every single day. Every day the ceasefire eludes us, Russia gains more resources. The situation is actually quite straightforward now. The US wants the war to end because they are broke, they want to recover their economy, and they want all the resources. The EU doesn't want the war to end on Russia's terms, but Europe doesn't have any leverage, and they are facing a trade war with Trump. So without doubt, Russia is entering the negotiations with a very strong hand even against the US. The EU will be just watching from the sidelines, and this is not a good situation for the collective West.